Hey Gareth, how you doing?
Hey, Alfie, I'm well. How are you?
Good, thank you. Back for another episode.
Back for another episode. Yeah, we didn't record last week, did we? Because we were together. Well, we weren't together on that day, but we were together last week in running our agency mastery program course. Weren't we down in London? So, but that
Indeed,
2 weeks since we recorded one of these, but it doesn't feel like that. As ever, the weeks are flying by towards Christmas.
100%. Looking forward to it as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, brilliant. So today, what are we talking about? I've got an idea, Gareth, and I'd love to know what you think about it.
go for it.
What do
Love
you
your.
think about the topic being organizational change? Because I think there's a lot of that going on at the moment. Changes happening within agencies, and some of the founders don't know why. And some of them are probably struggling to cope with that change. So, what do you think about a topic to help some of those founders with their issue?
Love it, yeah. I think that's a great idea. I mean, it's always been around this sort of how, coping with growth in agencies, just as it's a topic for any business for that matter, of course. Coping, managing growth. And I think actually, now you've said that, I think it's something that's for the last few weeks and months been a topic that's been even more relevant or even more frequently talked about in meetings I've had with agencies, actually. People have been I can think of 2 or 3 businesses that I've been talking to regularly about this stuff. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, brilliant. So, this was something we touched on at the agency mastery program. And I think two or three people in the room said how timely it was. Your
Yeah.
point, a lot of agency founders are thinking about this stuff. So, yeah. So, when we talk about organizational change, in your opinion, how would you describe it? What are we talking about? What is organizational change?
Organizational as a phrase or topic is actually quite a highbrow way of looking at it. It sounds like something out of a sort of management theory textbook, doesn't it? So how I'd describe it is, or people normally describe it to me, is actually in a very different way. It's in a very negative way, sadly. It's about pain. It's about stress. It's about challenges. It's about my business is out, my agency is out of control. As a founder, I've got people complaining. Work is suddenly becoming harder to deliver. The whole business sometimes it feels hard, it is feeling harder to deliver. So I think people often talk to me about it in those ways, in the sort of pinning their sort of feelings on the pain points. But actually, so often when people talk to me about that sort of stuff, I sort of try and lift it up to that phrase, organizational change, to say those are the symptoms that you're experiencing, but the cause, if you like, the root cause is organizational change. The agency is structure, how it operates, the mechanics of the business are changing, constantly changing, actually underneath. And sometimes we miss that fact. We just focus on other things. And when we do grow, the business and the structures should grow with us, but often they don't. Often we neglect certain things or we don't facilitate that growth. So that organizational change is described in pain points, but it's actually the structure of the business, how we work, how we operate, and particularly how, hence the word change, how we need to evolve it as time passes or the business grows, hopefully. Sometimes it contracts. So sometimes we need to react to that as well. And the organization needs to change to reflect a downturn or a retraction in what we're doing for the time being.
Mhm. Okay. So, that's a good breakdown. So, if I'm hearing you correctly, the fact that an agency is growing creates friction or challenges, right? And these challenges manifest themselves, should we say growing pains manifest themselves as issues in the business. Is
Yes.
that what you're saying?
Issues in the business. So yeah, people leaving, processes changing or not keeping up with the growth of the business, mistakes happening, disruption, chaos, friction in the business feels hard. Why is this so hard? People say to me, why is it? It's getting harder this every year, Gareth. And part, and not the sole reason, because we are in, at the moment, sadly, quite a downturn in the economy and growth in the economy and stuff. So part of the reason is reasons outside our control why it feels harder, but
Mm.
the stuff internally as well. And it's those growing pains. Yeah. we described it last time. I said, which is true. I can't remember it was sadly, but somebody put on LinkedIn a few weeks ago that businesses, agencies outgrow their shells like a lobster.
Yeah.
So I didn't know this till somebody put it on LinkedIn, but it's very interesting that lobsters, of course, they've got exoskeletons, haven't they, in the shells or whatever, and they outgrow them, and therefore they need to shed them. They go to the bottom of the sea and shed their shell and grow a new one, I guess. And whilst they're doing that at the bottom of the sea, they're quite vulnerable because of the lack of armour, ultimately. And that's what sometimes agencies need to do to grow. Don't need to shed the whole shell, but we evolve it and grow it. And whilst that's happening, yeah, things can be quite painful and we can be quite vulnerable. And ultimately, that's what often lots of founders are experiencing in these pains. But unlike the lobster, they're not actively doing anything about it. The lobster, by nature, knows what to do and knows to go to the bottom of the sea and knows what to do. But unlike as agency founders, sometimes we're not aware enough to do something about these challenges that we face, and keep things the same, keep structures the same, keep people the same, keep people doing the same things to the same process, and it just grows and grows and grows then and starts to hurt even more if we don't do anything about it, if we don't approach and embrace this sort of organisational change principle.
Uh-huh. You've mentioned in a lot of what you've been saying, you've mentioned the word process a lot. Process, process, process.
Yeah.
What are some of the things aside from process? And I'd love you to expand on the process side of things, but what are some of the other things that become painful as the agency grows?
Well, a process is certainly one of them, but I think I sort of normally put it down to four things, and I sort of what sort of breaks as you grow, if you like, if that's the question. Well, certainly processes. Arguably, I'd say processes don't break. It just becomes apparent that they're not there, that they're actually businesses, agencies are not running to a process. They're just running to habits. They're just running the business what they've always done. So they don't have a clear process. And but certainly that's one of them. Second one is people. So sometimes people break, sadly, and that in different ways, in different forms, people break because capability wise, the individuals we have in our business are capable of getting us to a certain point, but not beyond it.
Mhm.
And sometimes people break because too much workload, of course, stress and overwhelm, because the processes and these other things aren't growing with us. So sometimes the people break. Sometimes that's recoverable, of course, with people. Hopefully it is. Sometimes we can relieve them of some of the stress and pain, but also help them to grow themselves and help them to grow the business with us so that we can give them, a new opportunity to take us on to the next level. But certainly people break. Third one is profit breaks. You'll know more. You know a lot about this. You'll know more
Yeah,
than
absolutely.
you grow. You have an agency often in not early stages as in months, but as in the first few years, quite a small agency, small tight team, doing some good work, enjoying it and making some decent profit. But then you try and grow it and you add people and the business starts to grow, and some of these sort of structural problems and people problems, things kick in. More clients cause more stress and yes, more revenue, but because of the complexity of the business is growing, profit starts to shrink. So profit breaks, and we often we look back, our agency founders talk to us, don't we, and sort of say, I was making more money when I was 10 people, 5 people, whatever. And now I'm 15 people, 20 people, 30 people. I'm not personally making as much money as I used to do. And that's because of this sort of complexity and profitability issue. The business isn't as efficient as it used to be. So that's the third one. The fourth one is a big one, actually, is communication. So it's harder. It is a fact, but we don't realize this, as you grow, of course, the business, when there's 2 or 3 people around a table or online or a small team, you can communicate very easily. But when it becomes 10 people, 15 people, 20 people, the lines of communication don't just grow, but they sort of grow exponentially. So communication, despite all the technology and the tools we have at our disposal these days, the communication in terms of people's understanding of what needs to happen when and why, and people's interpretation, not just the Slack channels you've got, the communication breaks down and people start to go off and do their own things or not understand what we're actually supposed to be doing. So we're not aligned. So communication really affects and breaks as we grow.
Yeah. I like those four things you mentioned because You're absolutely right. Those are key things that break. And each of those four things, in my opinion, are interconnected because if we start from the top, you were talking about communication, right? So communication breaking is a natural thing. When you're a small agency, you've got the founder who's, at the head of the table telling people what they need to be doing. You've got a handful of people, it's easy to do that. But you start to grow as an agency, and all of a sudden, you lose that communication link to every person because, you've got different branches growing out and, people doing what they need to do without coming back to the founder as much. So when that happens, of course, the process, which, like you rightfully stated, some agencies don't even have to start off with, that breaks because if there isn't a firm structure in there to say, this is how we do things, this is the exact breakdown or document that shows how we do things. If none of that exists, and there's no communication to drive what needs to be done, then it all crumbles. And then, of course, my favorite, the profit suffers because then if the communication isn't there, the process isn't there, the work suffers, right? So delivery suffers, and which means you get clients that aren't happy with what you're doing, and then profit starts to go down. And then you got people stepping over each other in trying to deliver. And that means, again, profit suffers because the delivery isn't, top notch. And then, so yeah, I fully get all of that stuff and it definitely makes sense. And then, what would you say then about in the agency growing? One of the pain points being something we talked about on one of our episodes. I forget what number, I think number 3 or 2 or something, which is the founder being a bottleneck in that growth, right? So wanting everything to come through them as it did when the agency was small, but now that you're growing, again, without that process or communication and, people, that does that become a challenge in growth? Is that part of this friction?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I would say that sadly for the founders out there, the founder bottleneck, if you like, sits above all those breaking points, doesn't it? It's not always the root cause directly of those things that breaking those things, but it is the founder is fundamentally a part of, how those other things sort of starting to fall down. Because what we're talking about here is, a business that has grown. And again, we're talking agencies, but this can apply to other types of businesses as well. A business that is started by somebody from scratch, entrepreneurial person, person that's taken a lot of risk and continues to take risk in many ways about running their own business, starts to employ people, starts to take on the extra burden of needing to meet salaries for people every month, etc. And often that in the early stages, that for many people, not all people clearly, but many people, that can be quite successful, and you can grow a reasonably small business, on your own and on your back of your own efforts with employees, but being the leader of that business of a 5 to 10 person business. There's a lot of sort of stats out at the moment in the market talking about there's 26,000 or so agencies in the UK, which is a lot, but the largest portion of them by far, in terms of numbers, is businesses that are under £1 million. So the largest chunk of them by far in terms of revenue, I think the big groups of agencies employ more than 65% of the people in the sector. So there's a massive dominance of revenue and people employment, but in terms of numbers of businesses, they're often agencies very small. And those businesses have been, created by those entrepreneurs, but they can only usually those people can only get it so far because it becomes a business which starts to be the bottleneck starts to be them. If everything still passes through you as the owner and it's not the founder and it's not, delegation systems, all that sort of stuff starts to come into play, then the founder becomes a bottleneck, and ultimately, it's not their fault. They see and bear the brunt of the issues of that, of course, because it starts to become a very stressful business for them to carry, for want of a better term. And I think that's often something that happens, and recognizing that is the first thing that you can do to treat it, if you like. You've got to recognize that this business can't grow just on my sole efforts of leading it. It's the hardest thing to scale in any agency is the founder, and you can't because there's only one of them, one or two of them, and you can't scale that business if it's just built on. I always call it one. There might be one or two directors, but one genius and 1,000 helpers. And I don't mean they're necessarily geniuses, and I don't mean the helpers are just people running around doing exactly what they're told.
Hell,
But there's a sort of huge one person, and everybody comes to that founder with everything practically, answers to questions. What do we do next? This code's broken. How do I fix it? All the stuff from where did we run out of toilet rolls in the office? What do we do about that? And people fix all that stuff, don't they? But you can only do that to a certain scale, and that's where it starts to break down and becomes very difficult. You've got to sort of have a different approach to your business, which is this thing about organizational change. I've got to change how the business and I work here on the founder.
yeah. We've worked with people in the past, haven't we, who have had problems letting go, right? And everything coming through them. And what that has done has hindered their growth as an agency. Because, as you said, the hardest thing to scale is the founder, or it is practically impossible to scale the founder. So, to grow with the agency, the founders have to let go because I think they sit very comfortably in controlling everything, right? Everything coming through them means that they can quality control everything. They can, in their opinions, move faster than everyone else. And some of them probably feel they are more capable than everyone else. But I think it's more about creating that clarity for everybody. And that clarity involves the flow of information, whether it's financial information, non-financial information, and all of that sort of stuff. Basically, equip and empower everybody so everyone knows what they need to be doing. So it doesn't have to be all on them to deliver everything or answer every question or make the decisions and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's definitely a point there.
Totally, yeah. No, it was saying we've got to recognise it, but then to your point there, you've got to do something about it. And some people recognize the need to do something about it, but find doing something about it very hard. Why? All sorts of reasons. That sometimes they're addicted to the, oh, if I say power, but it is a power of sorts. Is that they're addicted to being the focal point in the business, being so the person that answers all the questions, right? Addicted to that power in a corrupting way, but in a way that this is my business and everybody wants to come to me and I get something from that, or addicted to it because they're passionate their business, they're very passionate about the work and the output, and therefore nothing should leave this agency without me seeing it because I want to make sure that it's exactly right and exactly how I've done it for 10 years. But then there's that addiction at play, but there's also what comes into people don't sometimes know how to change this because often lots of these founders have never worked in another business. Or if they have, they worked at a very junior level, set up that not run a business in any, or managed a business or a department for anybody else. They've worked in a business at a junior level, become very good at what they do, set up on their own as a freelancer. Then it's grown into an agency. So they've not really seen how businesses operate. So it's one of those situations where you don't know what you don't know. Really, you think by heroic efforts, by trying to answer as many emails and calls and questions every day as you possibly can, you will continue to grow the business, but it just becomes the bandwidth or whatever you want to call it just becomes too overloaded.
Yeah. And is it also, as you were saying that, I was just thinking, is it also an issue if everything's coming through the founder and the founder, again, touching on another episode where we talked about working in the business, working on the business rather than in it. If the founder is so overwhelmed with these, decision making and all of these other things, do you think that makes it harder for them to spot the symptoms of that friction as the agency gets bigger? Because they're tied up in it as well. They can't see there's this saying, you can't see what is on the label of a jar if you're in the jar or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, if they're in it, then they can't see the problems. Therefore, it might be harder to solve the problems. And that just causes more friction, stifles growth and all of that sort of problem. Do you think that is correct in assuming that might be the case?
Totally, yeah. I think that must be the case to some degree in every situation. I would say to greater and lesser degrees. Some people very much so, other people, but a little bit. But every founder must experience some of that, not being able to see the wood for the trees, firefighting every day spent firefighting. So that becomes the norm. And then when you do have a spare minute, or well, minute, but you do have some spare time, you find it very difficult then to start to focus. The old phrase, work on the business, not in the business. You're constantly in the business, so working on it becomes, and when you've got some time working on it, becomes very difficult. Which is why a lot of, I would say, I don't know if you'd agree, Alfie, but quite a few of the clients that you and I work with on a consulting basis, agency owners, either together or separately. That's why often I think those clients choose to work with us or somebody like us to give them that space. Every month therefore there is a couple of hours or half a day or whatever it is as in a meeting with external parties in our case, but they've got to focus on the bigger picture and running the business, and not yes, solving problems, but solving the problems for good, not just firefighting them and putting little fires out here, seeing how, looking at how we can stop fires starting in the first place.
Mhm. That's a good one. I spoke to someone one time. She owns an agency. Someone asked me to just help her out and give her some advice and stuff. And on the call, it was interesting because she was experiencing a lot of these friction pains, right? Complaining about delivery and people being overstressed and, a lot of different things. And it was funny because when I asked her about processes and whether or not, she had reviewed the processes within the agency, her response, almost in a defensive kind of way, was like, "Oh, no, there are no issues with the process or any of that sort of stuff." And in my mind, I was thinking, well, where do you think all of this is coming from? If the process and the communication and everything is so good, then you shouldn't be experiencing these things, right? Or at least you should be able to pinpoint where a few things in the process are broken or there's an issue to fix, right? But you can't stand back as a leader and go, oh, everything's all good. However, I'm experiencing these pains. Like you said, those
Yeah.
pains are the symptom of the problem, not the problem itself. So
Yeah.
it is interesting how some founders, I don't know why, just kind of feel like everything's good rather than try to really analyze the situation and put the pains into context. They just want to live in denial.
Totally, yeah. No, I see that all the time as well, and I think, but I think it's strange. It's a shame, but it's also strange because I rarely see an agency that has, or talk to an agency that has great processes, and it's very clear they must exist, but I rarely come across them. I would say, and I'm not saying this to blow my own trumpet or to big myself up, but I always attribute one of the key factors in the success of my own agency back in the day was actually processes. The fact that we had clear processes and we focused on how things were done and and approval points and what happens when things aren't approved, or what happens when things go wrong, or what happens when things are behind schedule, etc. That was quite a very process driven agency, and I genuinely believe it's one of the key factors in our success. And now when you see people saying, we've got loads of great processes, if you look under the bonnet, I rarely see that. There's always improvements in processes. And I think even if people have got that attitude, actually, Alfie, I think, and they're entitled to their own opinion, of course, but it's their business. But if people do have that attitude, I think now is the time to be looking at this stuff, processes. I think being entrepreneurs, often being creative people, being ideas people, or usually agency owners, I often reflect on, and again, it's not for me to say, it's people's own opinions of themselves, but I often reflect on whether this process stuff is actually quite hard yards for a lot of these, for anybody, but is particularly for these types of people as agency founders. It's quite boring stuff, you don't want to get round to, but it's so critical for the reasons we've been talking about, but also, of course, looking to the present and to the future. That AI, if processes have always been important, in the age of AI, they're even more important now because AI is here. AI is here to stay, and it can help us. It can be a massive improvement in our businesses, of course. But without clear processes, AI just is going to just exacerbate chaos. If
Yeah.
chaos exists, it's not going to fix it. AI is just not going to fix chaos. It needs to, it's a machine. It needs to work on processes, needs to work on an understanding of what's required when and how it works, and do the same thing over and over again. And so if you're trying, if we're trying to use AI in the future to solve chaotic systems and processes, we don't stand a chance. We need to fix the processes first, and then try to automate them where we can, where we want to, where we need to. And that's going to work. But without that, so it's more important than ever, this process stuff.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad you brought AI into it because, of course, like you say, AI is here to stay and all of that sort of stuff. And also, the agencies that win will be the ones that use AI. Yeah, I'm not saying AI will replace people, but use AI alongside people as leverage, right? To improve quality of work, to improve speed and all of that sort of stuff. In your opinion, the use of AI, and we're talking about people and processes, right? How do you see agencies working around the accountability piece as far as AI is concerned? Because if people are using AI a lot as part of growth, which we're talking about, what we try to encourage usually is for everybody to be accountable for something along the process. So if AI is coming in, is there that risk that people then defer their accountability or place everything on the AI, or how's that going to work? Because it just seems like it could be chaotic, and maybe that ties into what you're saying about getting the process right. But it sounds to me like there's the risk of things going completely haywire when you add AI into this mix, in terms of who's doing what, what's the process, who's accountable, and all of that sort of stuff. What are your opinions?
Yeah, no, it's great. I think again, we touched upon last week, didn't we, in our session with our delegates on our mastery program. Well, we didn't just touch upon it. We ran part of the session on accountability. It's so important. It's and such a missing factor again in accountability in growing agencies. That's another thing that starts to break. I didn't mention it before because I sort of tend to put it in the communication cut box. It's not
Okay.
just communication, but accountability is a big part of that, and it's a problem that as the agency grows, just becomes worse again because of the teams growing. Really, when you sat around, not everybody's sat around a table these days when it's a small business, but if it sat around the theoretical startup table, accountability is always strong naturally because you can literally lean over to people or ask or talk to them. Have you done this? Has that been finished? Is this going to be ready tomorrow? Whatever the question, and you get an answer. Whereas when you grow, and in particular these days when people are working remote, of course, as often they are, that is still possible with the help of technology, but it's hard. It still becomes harder. So accountability is what tends to fall down. But I always sort of say that accountability for me is people use their immediate reaction to lack of accountability, or when people are struggling with it in their business, is that it's a people problem. That person's not very accountable. They don't do, or they don't follow the process, or I never know quite where they're up to, or sometimes they finish, sometimes they don't. And it's the people, it's the individual, which of course there's an influence there. But I would say accountability is rarely a people problem. It's a design problem. It's the system. If the system isn't clear, and the processes aren't clear, and people don't understand what the systems and the processes are, they can't be accountable for it. And coming to your question, is AI going to exacerbate that? I think, again, it's not my style to be a doom monger, but I think there's a danger for some businesses that AI and implementing AI and without that processes and accountability clearly in place, well, yeah, you're right, that AI will just pour sort of petrol on a fire, really, and exacerbate it, because at least now we can expect individuals in our business to do certain things, and if they don't, we can ask them, and they can often swerve accountability, and that's somebody else's problem. Going forward, there's a danger that they might, well, no, that should have been automated, or
Yeah.
why didn't whatever that is, why didn't it happen? Well, that was an automation thing, or AI, got that wrong, or I don't know. why it didn't happen,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
it happened last week and now it hasn't happened. Is that my responsibility? I didn't realize I'm actually accountable. I didn't realize that. I just sort of sat back and thought that was just happened. So it's
Yeah.
just going to get worse if we don't fix it, particularly with AI. As a business grows, as an agency evolves, just becomes harder, but even more important at every step, really. Particularly, of course, when we talked about just now, when you as a founder are trying to step back, trying to delegate, trying to offload some of your work and not control, not spin every plate yourself. You need people that are accountable. You need systems that are accountable going forward as well, and people and systems accountable to each other.
True. That is true. So we've talked about, like I talked about the lady I spoke to who owned an agency and just couldn't see what was going on. Are there any, for lack of a better term, any lenses you could run these friction points through to kind of be able to identify them? Because in order for you to actually treat the problem or the symptoms, as we've called them, you need to identify them. So, are there any frameworks you can give for being able to, first of all, identify what these pain points are, and then secondly, how do we address it, having identified them?
Great question. I think what people again naturally do in this situation, I've done this myself, is with this friction in the system. When we're talking about friction, there's an invisible cost. This friction that you can't see it, but it's as you grow, it can build up, and it's all the things you mentioned earlier, Alfie, and more. It's poor communication, the lack of accountability, but more rework, more mistakes, clients not being happy, things taking longer than they should, and there are all sorts of underlying reasons. So it's a sort of cancer in the system, really, if I can use that word, which is a very emotive one, but it is a sort of, it can grow in the business and can start to consume the business. But it is natural. It's not something that you've done wrong. It's growth. It's growth in the agency creates this friction, creates this invisible tax. But the good news is you can legally avoid this tax, but you can't remove it if you can't see it.
Mhm.
So you've got to identify it. And I use 4 lenses, as you've called them, or 4 ways. There's 4 ways to look at it and try to eradicate some of this friction. And the first one is role clarity. So these are simple things, but again, often overlooked totally or underestimated in their power. But role clarity, so being absolutely clear on who owns what in the business,
Right.
looking at if we've got duplication of clarity. As a founder, sometimes we think we know that we're clear on who should be doing what, but the individuals aren't. Or they think they are. One of them thinks they are, but the other one thinks that. So there's overlap, there's confusion. So getting absolutely, this comes back down to a very simple thing of having everybody in the business with an up-to-date, regularly reviewed role profile, which is different from a job description. Some people get them too confused. They're just interconnecting, but it's 2 slightly different things. It's not a job description that we're putting in an ad. This is on what we're currently in each role. That role, not the individual necessarily. The individual is just occupying that role at the moment. What the role is responsible for, where those responsibilities start, where they end, where the accountability in that role is. So making sure everybody's got a role profile, step number 1. Very simple thing, obvious, but that's something that can start to remove some of this friction, because hopefully people then understand what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing, more importantly. Second one is we've talked about it a lot, but it's defining the processes. It's having a clear map on how processes in the business should work. There are thousands of processes, even in a small business, if you really break it down. And I don't suggest you start to do that. Start to pick at the key processes in the business. Pick 1 or 2 major ones, usually focused on the delivery side of the business, of course, first. That's the biggest bang for buck. And then map those processes so that everybody, again, is clear. This is all communication, really, in a way, that everybody's clear what the process is. And actually, as you're doing that, how can we improve them? How can we reduce the steps in the processes? How can we maybe put a step in that's missing? We might identify as a process here, but there's no quality control. So the work goes out without it. So ideally, we want to reduce the processes, streamline them. But if we see an opportunity to put, or we think there's a need to put additional processes in for quality to make sure that things are correct, etc., then we should do that. So process is definition number two. Thirdly, is it's massively important. I think this particularly in growing agencies, but the what I call decision architecture.
Yeah.
So again, clear visualization of how decisions are made in the business and what level of decisions these people in the business are responsible for and what level of decisions these people are responsible for. So it's an architecture because there's an escalation.
Yeah.
You might say to some people in junior level, you're responsible for making, the decision on how much work you need to do today. But there's a higher level up that has a responsibility for checking and making the decision on the quality of that work before it leaves the building, as an example. Or only at a certain level can people decide which, this came up recently as a live example as I'm thinking about it. There's an agency I'm working with where they've got quite a large development team, and it became very clear that then they're actually quite much skilled, they're very skilled, these people, and are sort of using lots of different technology. That's part of their proposition, that they're not tied to one piece of technology. And but it became very clear that people across the business and in the development team were deciding what technology to use for what job, what project. It sounds okay in principle, but some decisions were being made for non-commercial reasons. So some people were deciding to use new technology that they'd not really used before on the basis, not because that's what the project demanded or that's what commercially was the right thing to do, but because they fancied using it to test their own, to build their own skills, which is a valid decision in some ways, but commercially for the business, which is your area, suicide in many ways. So they put a decision architecture in to say there's all the development team, but there's only the three senior developers there, or in some cases it might be the CTO, but they make the decision on what tech we use, on what platform we use for each project. And they make it based on a number of factors, but crucially, how it could make sure it's commercially viable, the project, and we deliver it in a commercial way. So not everybody can make that call. Only the senior people can make that call. Other people can have an influence. The junior people can suggest a piece of tech or ask if we can use that tech for their own reasons. Happy to take that on board, but the decision is made by only a certain number of people. The decision architecture is crucial. And then the information flow. So how does information travel around the business? Massively underestimated this and the power of this. And it's off the back of clarifying the process. But it's looking at how does information go from point A to point C. And in some cases, it needs to go through B. But in other cases, no, that can just go from A to C directly. Quite sort of systemized, detailed stuff, this, but massively important because, again, another different example case study. I was working with somebody recently who identified there was 2 or 3 people in a paid social team, and the head of paid social and a couple of people working in that team for this lady. And the head of paid social, she gathered all the information for multiple ads from the client in one go, and was very prescriptive and very demanding of the client to say, I need all the information on a certain date because I'm going to do this in one block. And that's the right thing for you, and it's efficient for us. But our team were taking briefs, effectively, pieces of information on a daily basis and just executing them one by one. So she was doing them all in a big batch, and the team were doing them one by one. And of course, the batch was far more efficient, far more effective, harder to police, harder to control and demand for the client, but nevertheless, it was better for the agency and ultimately cheaper for the client because the people in the team were doing it sort of piecemeal and it was more expensive. So that how information flows, that's an example of information coming from outside the business, from the client inwards, but there's information, of course, inside the business all the time as well.
I can already see how, if you compare all of those friction points against these 4 things you've mentioned, you could actually start to quantify it, right? Because if you pick one of the friction points and you kind of go, okay, what's the process within the business? If you state that, you can run it against, is there clarity of role within what said process, right? Or is there information flow against said process? And then start to give them scores to kind of create more visibility around those friction points, right? Because only then can you say, I can prioritize this over that because this pain point isn't as difficult as the other one. It isn't as bad as the other one. So let's focus on this. So that's a really good one. If you take those four things, run the pain points against those, compare them against those four things and score them, you should then start to get a good picture on how bad things are and what to prioritize. Because somewhere in what you were talking about earlier, you did say you can't take everything, you can't solve everything at once. You
Yeah.
have to prioritize. You have to pick the worst ones and then address them. I've seen examples where agency founders try to take on too much, try to do too much too quickly, and it never works. They end up not doing anything, right? And initially it might seem like everyone's engaged and everyone's on board. Yeah, let's go ahead and do this, but it just ends up being too much for them to handle. And then the effect of that is things actually get worse because people feel like, well, we tried, it didn't work. I guess there's no hope now, or, those sorts of things. So I think prioritizing the size of the problem based on these four categories you've given is a good idea for agency founders to do.
Yeah, totally. We were talking last week, weren't we, about that subject and sort of saying, so what we've been talking about today again, where we've got overwhelmed founders and a overwhelmed business in many ways because of growth. Then sort of recognizing this and hopefully some people out there are listening to this and thinking, yeah, that's me. I need to do some of this. I need to do rethinking how my business works. But if you're already overwhelmed as a founder, you've already got a million problems and you've already got loads of questions, etc. every day, firefighting. To then try and wrap your arms around this whole subject and say, actually, I'm going to completely re-engineer the business. It's impossible. And that's overwhelming in itself. Here's the sort of analogy of this what we're talking about here, this organizational change, is rewiring the house, but while keeping the lights on. We still need to run the business, still need to deliver the work, but we've got to rewire the house a bit in terms of the electrics to make it ready for the fit for the future and sort of eliminate some of this sort of friction and stuff. I'm agreeing with you, of course, totally here. You need to prioritize, and how do you do that? What's the way of prioritizing? Some people say, well, I'll just pick that area there. And that's not the best way to do it, really, is Alpha, you know far better than I do, because your numbers is your world. But if you can put some quantifiable numbers to this stuff, you can start to really say, actually, no, that's the area I need to look at, because the data is telling me that that's the biggest priority, that's the biggest opportunity to solve my problem in that area first, and then I can move on to that next one. And, again, so yeah, putting the data to it in some ways is hugely important.
Yeah. And it is making a lot of sense thinking about it because those categories you've given there, those lenses to run the pain points through, can be used outside of just pain points, right? Because those are very powerful things to focus on. And you could apply them to areas of the business, right? So you can say, main areas of your business, new business, finance, and, whatever else, delivery and all of that. You could still use those lenses to quantify those areas as well, can't you? So you could say, for example, within your new biz department, is there clarity of role? Do people know what they're doing? Is there information flow? And then still quantify it. So I think that's a very powerful tool, actually, Gareth, just not just for the friction, but just to score different areas of the business against those categories that you've given to just see whether or not those areas are running efficiently or effectively, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So taking the different departments in your business, departments for want of a better term, and across the four lenses, giving them a score. So what we're sort of saying, aren't we? Giving them a 1 to 5 score, with 5 being, so excellent and 1 being very poor in across the four lenses. Have we got role clarity processes and across the departments? Is it 1 to 5 in this department? And then adding those 4 up at the end, you will give you a feel for, this is the area that is the weakest across these things, or maybe this is our weakest. We're not brilliant at process. I've been saying people are they're not good at process. We might find that an agency that is now absolutely brilliant at process, but the decision making is. But we know exactly what the process is, but it falls down because we haven't overlaid who makes the decisions and where they should make them. It's just people just follow the process, but they make the decisions as they go. So we might
Yeah.
find a sort of an area that is poor, or a department that is needs of prioritization.
Yeah. So I'm sure people that are listening to this will be thinking, okay, yeah, it sounds good. Roles, responsibilities, accountability, everything we've talked about here. But what happens, and you might have experienced this when you ran your agency, Garrett, what happens when the people within the business aren't, I don't want to use the term fit for purpose, but the people within the business aren't capable or ready for those roles? Is there something you can do to, first of all, again, assess them? And then two, what do you do about it?
Yeah, I did experience this a number of times in my business, and I've experienced it a lot with other people's businesses since, because I think, sadly, in many ways, that sometimes the people that got you from A to B can't get you to C.
Yeah.
Hopefully, that's not everybody, but there might be a chunk of people that were brilliant for in the early stages of the business, but they can't able to themselves to get you to the next level for all sorts of reasons. Maybe it's their capabilities, we've not trained them
Mhm.
enough. They only have experience of our business, not of other places. So we need external input now at this point, and to learn new things from new people. Maybe they got a bit stale in their role, all sorts of reasons. But identifying that is really important. And my first stage is to look at that, but also not making any knee jerk reactions. There are, with some of this stuff, in terms of clarifying people's roles, clarifying what decisions they can make, clarifying processes, and having a clear understanding of that, is making them clear on what they're accountable for and what they're not. And sometimes when you clarify all that stuff, a light bulb goes on in people's heads again, and so it's like, right, okay, I thought I was responsible for this stuff, but I wasn't sure, so I never really took the plunge and did anything about it. Or in some cases, people know they're responsible for it, but they might push back and say, well, look, I can't be responsible for it if I'm not accountable for it either. So when I'm making these decisions on what tech to use that example previously, you, Mr. or Mrs. Founder, need to back me if I make the wrong decision, if I make what you
Yeah.
consider to be the wrong decision, or not your decision, not the way you would have done it. Because if I'm not given the full autonomy, then can't run it. And when those conversations happen, sometimes it clarifies it again, and people step up, don't they? They grow into the role again, start growing again themselves. But occasionally, as you alluded to, that doesn't happen, and people need to change themselves. The business need to change. So never knee jerking, but there are some tough decisions to be made sometimes to say, that's a great person. They've been with me from day one. Really helped grow my business, but I think the business has outgrown them now, and I need somebody more, not necessarily, more experience, with other experience, other knowledge, to come in and do their role so that it can take this onto the next level. And that individual goes somewhere else, hopefully, and use their skills to bring somebody else up on the ladder, help them grow their business at a different stage. So those decisions sometimes are made. We got to sort of take those people decisions. We don't want too much of that, of course, but sometimes it's tough decisions, and they need to be made and acted upon. Because if you don't act upon them, then no matter this sort of process definition or design architecture or role profiles or whatever it is, as useful as they might be, it's if the person particularly in a key role is not capable of or willing to sort of think differently or take those on or work with them, then that's going to be a barrier, isn't it? It's not going to be good for the business, not going to be good for them.
Yeah. I've seen that many times actually, where people aren't good for the role, because at the end of the day, as a founder, you have to come to terms with the fact that you can't take everybody with you, right? There's some people, like you said, they helped you get from point A to point B, but they're not necessarily right for B to C kind of thing. But I have seen instances where people probably due to some of the things you've talked about here, the lack of clarity of role or flow of information and all of that stuff appear to be bad at a particular role. But then once they, apply some of those things, like clarify the roles and all of that stuff, they get better. Or in some cases, training might be involved to where, they train them on the new process or on the new role or that sort of stuff, and they get better. Or in some cases, maybe the role was wrong for them in the first place, and then they get moved to a different role and they become superstars, right? But you can't figure any of this stuff out until you've done the exercise you talked about there in terms of, quantifying all of these things and then identifying these problems. Only then can you see that, yes, this is the issue and we can tackle it this way. Because, and then the last thing is sometimes the people just need to move on. If the place is not for them or the role is not the business, they need to be somewhere else. And again, I've seen that where, someone was really bad at a role in an agency, 5 years down the line, you hear this person is now at XYZ business working in-house and they're smashing it there, right? So all of these kind of things, it just depends on the individual, and I guess depends on the role that they're in and whether or not those factors have been identified and actioned, so to speak.
Totally, no, totally agree with that. Yeah, sometimes this, when you're sort of shedding your lobster shell, that people are sometimes a casualty of that, aren't they? But that doesn't
Yeah,
mean to say they become absolutely like you. I absolutely echo that. I've seen many, many people throughout my career that, we're not working out, or, we didn't work with going forward. But then, looking at LinkedIn these days, they're very, very successful. And people, we all need, people need sometimes those sort of career jolts or
yeah,
that sort of experience to then move on themselves, don't they? It's actually, you know what? No, in this new role, I'm going to approach it slightly differently. And that, again, it's all growth, isn't it? Growth for them as individuals, whilst the business hopefully grows that they've left behind, and the new business that they've joined grows as well.
yeah, yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gareth. So we've covered a lot of things today. We've covered growth, the consequences, or as you put it, the tax for growth. We've talked about the pain points or the friction points that come with growth. We've talked about, founders and the role they play or them being part of this problem, by being a bottleneck. We've talked about the solutions or tools you can use to identify these problems and hopefully quantify them and solve the problem. So I think we've given the people a lot to, think about and a lot to address. So are there any last words, anything, any bit of advice you want to give people that we probably haven't touched on before we go?
Yeah, we have covered a lot there. I know you've just gone through it, so summarised it all for you. It's been a good discussion, hasn't it? But I think what to leave people with, I think, all these stuff that we've mentioned and more is important as businesses grow, agencies grow. This organisational change piece really important, but it is a huge thing. And I think the one thing to leave people with, it isn't just one thing either. It's not a project. It's not something to be done in the next couple of months or weeks, even if people are aggressive with it. It's not something to be done in the next week, couple of weeks or months. Something to be started now, but it's a continual process. This change is always happening. Change will always need to happen. So treating this as part of the running the business, that we will have to continually review how we work, what processes we use, who's responsible for what. I often find that people are, and I understand it because it's this overwhelmed thing, but founders are, tired and jaded by all this stuff. And when will it stop? It won't end on a low, but sadly, I think it won't stop, because growth is constant. So to change and facilitating change needs to be constant. It's part of running a business. So I guess to end on a high, if I can, the sooner you accept that and come to terms with it and embrace that, then the better you are placed to react to that change and improve your growth.
Perfect. Couldn't have said that better, Gareth. Cool. Thank you so much. And yeah, look forward to the next session.
Thank you, Alfie. Always great to speak to you. And yeah, let's see you next time.